Lesson 16, Part 1, Imperfect Middle Passive Indicative. We've already learned the present middle passive indicative. The imperfect middle passive indicative has the same meanings except they are in the past. Just like in the present, the imperfect middle indicative and the imperfect passive indicative are the exact same form. Context will tell you which it is in a sentence, though as we've said before, passive is far more common than middle. So the imperfect middle indicative is esodzamein, esodzu, esodzita, esodzametha, esodzeste, esodzanta. If you take a minute and pause the video, see what observations you can make about the forms of these words, things that are similar to things you've seen before, things that are different. So first off, we're noticing that all of these are beginning with an epsilon. This is from the word sozo. So the epsilon at the beginning is an augment, which shows us that this is a past tense. All of the past tenses in the indicative have an augment at the beginning. They also all have secondary endings. These endings are the secondary B endings. We use the secondary A endings in the imperfect active. Here are the secondary B. If you'll remember back to the lesson on the present middle passive indicative, I said that the primary B and secondary B endings are exactly the same for the first person plural and second person plural. And that's what we see. We see ametha and este. So we've got the A endings are amen and ete. The B endings are ametha and este. Those are pairs that are identical for the two of those, which are quite helpful to remember. Now, if you'll remember back to the primary B endings, we had etai and ontai. Here we have eta and anta. So that's very similar, except the alpha iota at the end is now an omicron, but that et and ont is going to be the same for both of them, which can be quite helpful for us to try to remember those two there. Up here, we've got an U. This is actually, the ending is something with a sigma in it. I think it's a sigma omicron, which would have an epsilon in front of it. And so what happens is the sigma drops out and those letters blend together and we actually get an U here. Unlike the other endings though, I don't remember if it's primary B or secondary, but the other one that I was saying before that had that sort of psi ending, which would be a B ending. So that would be the primary Bs. The primary Bs that have that sort of psi ending that shows up sometimes. As far as I'm aware, this one pretty much is always going to show up as an U. If occasionally you see a random sa, though, it'll look like sort of like this with the ta on the end. It'll have a sa on the end. That could be this one here. Then going up to first person singular, we had amai for the primary B. Here we have main, so that mu can sort of help us out a little bit thinking about the first person, but we do have to memorize that one there. As you can see, we've got the for myself, for yourself, or who, for whoever at the end there. And this is the same as we've done before, but we're going to change this into the was. So I was saving for myself, you were saving for yourself. Very, very similar to the imperfect active indicative, but adding the for myself, or contrastively, very similar to the present middle indicative, but changing it to the past. I was saving. For the translation of the verb, we're going to use this frame, I was or were blanking for blank self. So I was saving for myself or whatever it is with the particular verb and the particular person we're talking about. So if it's imperfect passive indicative, it's going to be I was being saved, you were being saved, he was being saved, we were being saved, ye were being saved, they were being saved. It's passive, so we have to have a form of be right before the past participle. Then because it's progressive, we have to have a form of be with an ing. So we have was being or were being, was and were because we're in the past tense. For the translation of the verb, we're going to use this frame, I was or were being, or blank was or were being blanked. The endings we have found on these verbs are called secondary B endings. So here are the formulas for the verb tenses we've learned so far. So in the present active indicative, no augment, first stem, primary A. For the present middle passive indicative, no augment, first stem, primary B. For the imperfect active indicative, we have augment, first stem, secondary A. For the imperfect middle passive indicative, we have augment, first stem, secondary B. Now this first stem here, you're probably thinking, well, what are the other stems? We won't get to those until Greek 2. The first lesson of Greek 2 will introduce the second stem, which is what's used for the future. But for the moment, where all of the verbs we've learned, the stem doesn't change at all. That is the first stem. It's also called the progressive stem. All 4 of these verb tenses are progressive, which is why we translate them progressively. Now you notice contrast between no augment and augment. The present does not have an augment. The imperfect does have an augment. Now, something that you can't quite tell the pattern enough from here yet, but if we were to add more tenses like the aorist tense and the future tense, you would see a pattern emerging. Augments and secondary endings go together when you're in the indicative. That will change when you get to the imperative or we get to the subjunctive. Those are late in Greek too. But an augment and secondary endings go together, and both of them go together with the concept of a past tense. So the imperfect tense is a past tense, so it has an augment, it has secondary endings. The aorist, which we'll learn about lesson 5 or 6 in Greek too, is a past tense, so it has an augment and it has secondary endings. Now, if we'll look here at which have A's and which have B's, actives have A endings, middles and passives have B endings. There will be one major exception to this that we won't learn until about halfway through Greek 2, but that is the main rule of thumb. Actives are A, middles and passives are B's. So if you can remember those couple of rules, augments and secondaries go on past tenses, and then A's go on actives, B's go on middle passives. You could actually recreate this entire chart from memory without actually having to memorize anything, just knowing those couple of principles, which are very good to have in your mind. Verbs that are deponent in the present are also deponent in the imperfect because they all have the same stem. So erkomai means I am coming. Erkomein means I was coming. We've got that augment that lengthened the epsilon to an eta at the beginning, then we've got the amein ending. So I was coming. It looks like it's middle passive, but it's a deponent, so we're going to translate it actively. Now, random note, this same form looks like arco in the imperfect middle passive indicative. If you're thinking of arco, okay, we're going to need to add an epsilon or add an augment, which would lengthen this from an alpha to an eta, take off the omega, add amein. It would look identical. However, arco never shows up in the imperfect. So if you're ever parsing this word, or if you're ever translating this word, erkomein or any of the other 5 forms of it, just know that it's going to be erkomai. It's not going to be arco. Sorry, that's really weird, but that's just the way that Greek works. Summary: imperfect middle passive indicative equals augment plus first stem plus secondary B endings. The forms of the imperfect middle indicative and imperfect passive indicative are identical. Verbs that are deponent in the present are also deponent in the imperfect.